I'm Ken Rockwell, Nikon's latest Z50 II. This is my favorite Nikon mirrorless camera. Why? Because it handles great, and although it's also very inexpensive, it takes the same fantastic pictures the bigger and clumsier cameras take. So let's take a look at some of the snaps. All are taken with this camera and this little plastic kit lens, which actually collapses for carrying. It works in any light and can pretty much shoot anything, so let's take a look. Here's the Pillbox Tavern, and I'm sorry that there's an annoying TV. It's kind of spoiling the picture. It was way too bright. But in any case, this is with the Z50 II, the Z16 to 50mm DXVR at 16mm wide open at f3.5, handheld at 1/6 of a second at auto ISO 140, which this little lens has great stabilization. There's no need for in-camera stabilization because all the Nikon VR lenses have such good stabilization. Here's the Super Pig and a passing NCTD bus. This is shot Z50 II, same kit lens as all these shots are. This just happened to be a 32.5mm wide open at f5, handheld at 1/13 of a second at auto ISO 2500. Now, of course, I'm an artist, and so vivid colors like this don't usually happen in reality. They just happen in my imagination. So I amped up this one and added vignetting deliberately in Skylum Luminar Neo software, and I've got links to that in the description of this review. Much like this shot here of a parking garage in California, this was amped up a little bit with Radiant Photo software. And I always use these because it helps me get the picture the way they look I want it to look faster than trying to do everything manually in Photoshop. This is with the kit lens at 16mm at f11 for 1.3 seconds, handheld, braced against the car window at auto ISO 200. Now, the thing here is that I wanted f11 to get the wall on the right in focus as well as the background. Wanted the ISO kept as low as I could to keep the image as sharp and as clean as I could, and that meant a little over a second. And with my rock-steady hands, holding it against the car, along with the VR, looks just great. For just walking around daylight shots, I'm really impressed at this camera's exposure ability. I have not had to use exposure compensation for any of the images I've shot with this, which is unusual. I don't think I've ever had a camera this good yet. It oftentimes requires a little bit of positive exposure compensation or negative exposure compensation with other cameras. So maybe it's just that I haven't shot this one that much yet, but I'm impressed. This is with the 16 to 50 DXVR kit lens at 22mm at f10 at 1/320th at auto ISO 100. And by the way, I usually shoot these always in program exposure mode. I give you the f-stops and millimeters. I'm not looking at that when I'm shooting it. I'm only reading it out of my software after I've shot this. And I do have a separate full review of this. Everything is at my website, kenrockwell.com, as well as I have a tutorial showing exactly how and why I do all these things with the Z50 II. Here's a quiet sunset with a very suspicious contrail. This is at 16mm at f6.3 at 1/160th of a second at auto ISO 100. And this is actually as I shot it. I didn't use any software to amp up the colors or anything. This shot here, I had to mess a lot with adjustment layers and curves and masks in Photoshop because the mural was faded and the light was crazy. So to get this look the way I wanted it to look, I had to play around with it a little bit. But the most important thing is here, this is with the lens at 16mm wide open at f3.5, handheld at 1/6 of a second at auto ISO 220. And to be honest, I don't know why people bother with full frame. I think full frame is no longer necessary. This lens gets more in focus because it's a shorter focal length with the smaller sensor. And the small sensors look great at any ISO. So with the kit lens, I can shoot anything at any light. If you wanted to get other lenses, God bless you. But I don't see any reason for anything other than the kit lens, so long as it covers the focal lengths you need. And of course, right place, right time. Here's Fisherman at sunset. This is at 50mm at f11 at 1/500th at auto ISO 100. So why do I love this so much? It all comes to usability. I shoot every day. I'm not a YouTuber. I'm not a guy who just talks about it. I shoot every day. And this YouTube is basically for fun, but don't tell anybody that. And what I really find useful about this is it has a real live mode dial, which I can just hit with my thumb, shooting with one hand, and I can change my exposure modes, which I often do. If I'm shooting in program, as I usually do, and I suddenly want to force a particular aperture or force a particular shutter speed, I just go to the appropriate setting and I'm there. I love the U1, U2, and U3 modes because I program them each for a certain kind of situation. I use U1 for my nature and landscapes and things that hold still. I use 2 for people photographs, and U3 for action. And also in my written review at kenrockwell.com, and the links are in my description, I have even the files for setting up the camera, which you can download into your camera and have it set up exactly as I set mine. That's another nice thing about this camera. It's an inexpensive crop sensor camera, but it has all the big boy features, like allowing me to load my settings onto a card, which then I can upload to my website for you guys to download to your own card and put into your camera and have it set up just like I set mine. In U1, I have very high saturation set up. I shoot in program exposure mode. I set the auto ISO slowest speed to a very slow speed so I can hold it as you saw for most of those shots. If I'm photographing people who are moving, I'll set the saturation to something more reasonable, and I'll set the slowest speed in auto ISO to 1/25th. And for action, I'll set that to, say, 1,000th. But anyway, take a look at my how to use this camera video for all that. But I do love the handling of this camera because it does have this knob. The other fancier cameras replace this knob with an LCD screen, which is just for show. And then to change these modes, instead of just doing it like this, I have to hold the button, spin an unmarked dial, and then look through the finder. And by the time I figure that out, it seems silly, but when you're actually shooting, life waits for nobody. And it's important to me to have instantaneous control of my camera so I can get my thoughts onto my card rather than fiddling with the camera. Fiddling with the camera is not photography. Grabbing an image and imagining it is photography. What's new about this compared to the original Z50 is it now goes to 30 frames per second with its electronic shutter. Although at 30 frames per second, there are a bunch of restrictions, so see my written review for what you can't do. For instance, you only can shoot JPEG, normal, large. You can't shoot RAW or anything else for file formats, but one of the reasons that is limited is because the camera uses its internal resources to give you a 300 frame buffer rather than the usual 50 or 60 frame buffer. And by using that extra memory to do that, you lose the ability to do some other things. It has a USB-C rather than micro USB port on the side for charging and data. USB charging is now twice as fast. It charges in 1 hour and 40 minutes versus 3.5 hours. They no longer include the external battery charger, which we no longer need. Autofocus works much better than it used to. It adds the U3 setting here, which I find very helpful, as opposed to effect setting on the older camera. The older camera had annoying touch buttons here for magnify and minify and display. Thank goodness those are now replaced with real live buttons on the side. Another reason to love this camera. I can shoot everything with one hand like this. The only thing I can't do is to set the advanced mode and to delete photos that are on the wrong side. But most importantly, the menu button and the play button that are on this side. So I love to shoot one-handed because my other hand is usually holding something else. The finder is brighter than the original. I never had a problem with the finder brightness on the original, but this is good. This has a new dedicated picture control button, which honestly I don't find very useful because I program my picture controls to change around my U2, U3, and so forth, but to each their own. New is a skin softening option in the menus. It goes to 4K 5994 video, up from 4K 2997, but guess what? Having worked for a long time in Hollywood, secret is everything's shot at 23976 or 24.00 frames per second for cinematic look. The only reason for the higher frame rates are if you want it to look like video and have very smooth motion, which when we're telling a story with dramatic things, 24 frames is the way to go. New is manual shutter speeds can go out to 15 minutes, and I show you how to get those in my settings video. It has a 3.5mm headphone jack. The original Z50 lacked a headphone jack, although they both have microphone inputs. Also improved is the LCD flipping mechanism. This one actually works. Down and around, just like it should. The old one was an immensely complicated mechanism that only allowed you to flip the screen up or down a little bit. It has an EN-EL25A battery, which is a little more capacity than the old one. No big deal. It's very slightly taller and deeper. There's no more night vision mode that I could find. And the self-timer no longer resets to cancel itself when you turn the power back on. Very minor things. Marvelous is it has a built-in flash. People will make fun of me for liking this. As a real photographer knows, the only important technical thing that you have to worry about in photography is lighting. Having the ability to pop this up and get some extra light on my subjects who might be in shadow is immensely important. And it's not something you can replace in software. You can imitate it, but having the right lighting is always the best. And if you don't happen to have a flash with you, this little guy is always a lifesaver. And guess what? In my studio, I can use this to trigger my studio strobes. No problem, easy peasy. So I love having that in the camera, and I wish they all did. What's missing is there's no sensor cleaner. It's got a very basic battery, so it does not have a percentage indication. It just has a 3-segment battery bar icon. Autofocus is fast and accurate. I have not found any problems. It has an AFA mode to select magically between continuous tracking or focus and lock for still subjects. Thank goodness it has automatic subject type detection. Some of the other brands, like I think Sony, will have some very fancy cameras that lack that, which means if you really want the autofocus to track well, you've got to go in there in the menus and manually tell it if you're tracking a car or a cat or a person or whatever. And I don't know about you, but I don't consider that autofocus if I have to stop and tell the camera what I'm looking for. Manual focus, like all of the Nikon mirrorless cameras, is the best in the business. You just turn the manual focus ring and it automatically goes straight to manual focus. Auto white balance is excellent. There are 4 kinds of auto white balance, and I explain in my guides how to sort through them, which again, if you've got 4 kinds of auto white balance, which you have to select depending on the kind of light that's around, is that really auto white balance? Let's look at high ISO performance, which works great. What's good is, and I'm going up a stop each time, as you can see marked here, every camera gets softer and crummier looking as the ISOs climb. This camera does go to ISO 204,800, which looks like garbage, as you will see, but that's just for marketing. You don't have to use that setting. I find for most things where you're seeing the full image here, just full frame, anything up to about ISO 25,600 looks the same as the lower ISOs. But as soon as you get to 512, 102, 400, 204, 800, they start looking crummier and crummier. But that's typical. If you know what you're doing, you never should be using a 5-digit ISO. Did you see all the shots that I showed at the beginning? They're all shot in like around at 100 or 200, even in low light. And only one of them did I go up to ISO 2500. And for me, that's pretty extreme. If you know what you're doing, you don't need ISOs like that. Let's now crop into the very same images I just showed you. These are 9 times magnification images, just showing details of the clock that was on the right. These are all the same files. Now, of course, these are very highly magnified in such a way that I don't think you would ever actually look at something magnified this wide, i.e. imagine something 9 times wider than your screen here when you're watching this, held at the same distance. You wouldn't look at an image this close. But you see as we go up in ISO, we first lose the fine details between the numbers, all little scroll work. Then as we go higher, we lose the little marks to mark off each minute. Go higher still, we lose the marks for each hour. Then we start losing the numbers that mark the hours. At the very highest ISOs, it's so bad you can't even see the numbers, but that's normal. The higher ISOs are simply trying to extract what few photons hit the sensor and turn it into some sort of an image. Let's now crop from the dark part of the image, the dark grill on the fireplace, and you'll see, of course, at ISO 100, we have the most details. You can see the screen that's there. As the ISOs climb, the fine screen disappears. As we go higher in ISO, the bricks behind that screen go away. And at the very highest ISOs, there's nothing left but garbage. But that's to be expected. Mechanical quality of this camera? It's essentially all plastic. The only things metal on this are the flash shoe, the strap lugs, the lens mount, and the front half of the bottom cover, which is this piece here. This back piece is plastic, and the tripod socket. Everything else is plastic. What is nice, though, is in addition to the optics being glass, the cover plate for the LCD appears to be glass as well. It is nice. It's a small camera. It's not super high speed for the mechanical shutter, so it's relatively quiet and refined when you're shooting even with the mechanical shutter rather than the electronic shutter. What's weird is it's hard to find the electronic shutter because it's not in the shutter type menu. See my guides, link to them in the description of this video, which will show you exactly how to find all of the kinds of shutters that this camera can do. What's wonderful about this camera, which none of the Canon cameras can do, but every iPhone does, is the way it's supposed to be done. When you're playing back an image, just rotate your camera, the images will rotate to it. So if you have a vertical shot, Sure, if you turn your camera vertically, it'll fill the screen, but this is the way it should be, just like an iPhone. I absolutely would recommend this Nikon, probably over any other Nikon camera mirrorless for a basic kind of camera. You should get it with this lens. This 16-50 lens is marvelous because it's super tiny and fits this sort of a camera. They also make a 50 to 250 millimeter lens, which is a wonderful choice, and you can get them both as a kit with this camera. You can get an ultra wide, which is a 12 to 28 millimeter, which is an excellent lens. The problem is I'm not a huge fan of the Nikon system. They only make one serious APS-C camera. They make the old version of this, and they make this one. They also make a Z30, which as of this Christmas 2024 video, the Z30 doesn't even have a viewfinder, so I'm not sure if that even counts. Canon, for instance, has a line of 4 top-notch APS-C cameras, and Sony has, I don't know, a whole catalog full of them. So the point is, if this is the camera you want, and there's no reason you'd have to really go beyond this, it's a great camera. Autofocus and tracking work great at high frame rates, which it will do with no problem. But if you want to go beyond it, there is no longer lens than that 50 to 250 millimeter lens. Your next lens would be the 100 to 400 Z lens, which is about $2,500. If you go with Canon for about $600, $700, $800, depending on what's on sale, they make a 100 to 400 that works great with their little mirrorless cameras. So if you intend to go much beyond this, I would suggest going with Canon. If you're happy with this, and again, I have no problem taking every kind of photograph there is with this camera. I really prefer its ergonomics to the other Nikons that are more popular with hobbyists. For instance, hobbyists just love the Z8 and the ZF, but I find this camera handles better. And again, we're all different. We all want different things, and that's why hopefully I can share with you what I found about this camera. But by all means, it's an inexpensive camera. It has all the big boy controls. It's not a little thing with abbreviated controls. It has better controls than Nikon's top cameras. So that's it. For the full written review, as well as the full downloads of all the images I showed you, so you can analyze them to your heart's content, go to kenrockwell.com, and the links are in the description of this video. And I thank you very much for watching Ken Rockwell, kenrockwell.com, and kenrockwell.tv.